For today's video, I've gotten my hands on one of the most unusual and unique vehicles that you can buy in America. It's the 2019 Polaris Slingshot. In around 45 states or so, this is classified as an autocycle, and that means that I can drive this vehicle without a motorcycle license in those states, although it does register as a motorcycle. So you notice when we get to the rear, it has a motorcycle license plate on it. It also means that this does not have to meet all the same standards as a four-wheeled car out on the road. The Slingshot is targeted at someone that wants a weekend car with a little bit more flair, a little bit more panache than perhaps a Mazda Miata. And price-wise, this is right in there with alternatives like the Miata. This starts around $20,000, ends up right around $30,000 if you get everything, which is the model that we're looking at right here, the Grand Touring trim. Up front, we have sort of a Batman meets Darth Vader theme going on. We have 4 headlamp modules, 2 in the center and 2 on the outboard sides. And then we have amber turn signals on each side. From this angle, you can definitely see the wide front tires, 225 width tires on the model that we're looking at here. 205 with front tires will be found on the base trim. The lightweight construction allows the Slingshot to weigh just under 1,800 pounds in most trims. That is definitely lighter than something like a Miata or an Alfa Romeo 4C. In terms of overall length, this is actually surprisingly long at 149.6 inches long. This is only about 4 inches shorter than a Mazda Miata, but 1 inch shorter than a Mini Cooper, but definitely longer than a Fiat 500. In keeping with the roadster meets motorcycle theme, we don't have any doors on the Slingshot, so you just hop in right there over these side tubes that are part of the structure of the vehicle. Because we're driving the top-end Grand Touring trim, we have a bit of a top. This opens right like that on each side, has little magnets to hold it in place, and then a small latch right up front if you want to close it a little bit more securely. That gives you a little bit of shade, but not really that much additional protection, because you'll notice we don't really have a windshield up front here either. From this angle, you can better see what's going on with the windscreen. It really is more of a wind deflector. It's designed to get the air up and over the vehicle, but still allow a lot of things through. So it's open right up here, right in that area, and it's actually also open right down there at the bottom. So this is not going to protect you from rain, obviously. We don't have any windshield wipers, and it's not going to protect you from bugs hitting you in the face. So Polaris does recommend that all people in the vehicle wear a full face helmet. At this moment, I should insert the disclaimer that I also recommend wearing a full face helmet, except that one was not available at the time that I was able to get this Polaris, so I will be wearing a partial face helmet and glasses. Moving to the rear, we have a motorcycle license plate because, again, this is registered as a motorcycle, and California is one of the states that has the autocycle category, so I don't need a motorcycle license to drive this. The one rear wheel is kind of an interesting touch. We have 3 different tire sizes available, 265 width in the base model, 305 width in the sport model, and if you get this Grand Touring trim, it actually drops all the way down to a 255, theoretically to give it a slightly better ride and be a little bit more balanced with the 225 width tires up front. We have a single shock absorber and a single spring over there on that side because the rear wheel does sort of hinge on the back of the vehicle. The exhaust is tucked up under there, underneath the vehicle. It does kick up a little bit of dust if you're out on dustier road surfaces like this. We have LED tail lamp modules with LED turn signals that you can see flashing over there on that side. At this point in time, you might be wondering where the bumpers are. Well, they're not required because this, again, is registered as a motorcycle. Right here above the license plate, we have a backup camera, which is actually a really good thing because if you look at the overall design of this, rearward visibility is not as good as many roadsters out there because of the overall design, the headrest, the roll bars, etc., and the fact that you're going to be wearing a helmet. The Polaris may look sort of like a grown-up go-kart, but under the hood we have a real car engine. This is actually a General Motors 2.4-liter 4-cylinder engine that produces 173 horsepower and 166 pound-feet of torque. That means that parts and maintenance are going to be very easy to come by. The engine is mated to a 5-speed manual transmission only, and that sends power to the rear wheel. So for those keeping track, this is a one-wheel drive, 3-wheeled car. The Slingshot, because of its overall design, is not obligated to have an EPA fuel economy score. However, if it did, I suspect this would be right around 27 or 30 miles per gallon. This does have a 9.6-gallon gas tank, so it should get you just under 300 miles in terms of overall range. Because we have a single wheel in the rear and it needs to move a great deal in order to soak up bumps, and it's not exactly moving straight up and down, we have a belt drive unit to connect this to the transmission up front. Transmission again is a regular 5-speed manual transmission. The drive shaft comes out of the transmission, and then actually he uses an angle gear. It doesn't use a differential because we only have one wheel back here. So it just goes out, turns to the left, and then connects to this belt drive right back here. Since there really isn't anything to compare the Slingshot to, I'm just going to say that the front seats are quite comfortable. I would actually say that depending on your body shape, these might be even more comfortable than the seats that we find in the Mazda Miata. There's not quite as much bolstering going on in this particular seat design as the top-end Recaro seats in the Miata, but I think overall the way that the lumbar support is positioned is actually a little bit better for my body shape. Keep in mind, of course, that you will be wearing a helmet when you're in this seat, and that's why we find a headrest that's a little bit further back than normal. As with many ultralight vehicles, the front seats do not adjust for height. They simply move forward and backward. And that means that if you're outside sort of the 80th percentile male in terms of overall body size, then you may have troubles fitting in this vehicle, especially if you're a bit taller and you want this roof. I don't have a problem with this. I have about 1.5 inches, 2 inches left, and that's enough room for me to have a helmet on and not be bopping the ceiling panel. But if you're much taller, that could be a problem. If you're much shorter than I am, you may have difficulties seeing out of the vehicle. Polaris gives us a tilting but not a telescoping steering column, and the gauge cluster moves with the steering wheel. An interesting touch with this interior is that they tell us it is water resistant, so you should be able to rinse out the floorboards, etc. without really worrying about it. That's quite logical, of course, because without a roof in most models and without a windscreen, if you do encounter a rainstorm, things are going to get a little wet in here. Between the seats and the rear of the vehicle, we find 2 lockable storage compartments. You tilt the front seat forward, insert the key, and then you can open the storage compartment right like that. There's a weight limit of 25 pounds, they claim, in this cargo area, and you could fit perhaps a very small carry-on bag. There is a seal around the compartment to help keep most of the water out, but you shouldn't consider these compartments to be absolutely watertight. The passenger side glove compartment is where we find a USB input for the infotainment and navigation system and a 12-volt power port. Now let's take a look at the inside. We have those fixed headrests that you can see right there on the passenger side. We have Slingshot embossed on this leatherette seat design, and then we have contrasting red stitching on the side for the bolsters, on the seat back cushion, and on the seat bottom cushion as well. You can see the seat belt right there for the passenger, and a little helper handle to help the passenger get out since they don't have a steering wheel. There on the floor we find the optional sound system that we have in our particular model. It's a Rockford Fosgate system. In the middle of the dashboard, we have a color touchscreen infotainment system in the model that we're driving. This system is water resistant as well, so we have rubbery buttons right down here across the bottom, a power button to turn off the screen, volume up, down, a button to take us over to our media interface, navigation interface, and a screen where we can see a few different views. So for instance, we have our trip computer over here and navigation, we have our trip computer and media, or we can have our media and our navigation system. There's also a button for the Bluetooth phone interface, which personally I find hilarious since I'm not sure who could hear you on the phone while you're driving the Slingshot, because it is a little bit on the loud side in here, as we'll see in a bit. Below the infotainment screen, we find the engine start-stop button, but you'll notice on the left side of your screen that we actually also have an ignition key. So in this vehicle, you put the ignition key in, and then you press this button to start the engine. Below that, we have our shifter. I'll take that out of gear so you can see that. So we have our stability control disable button right there, so you can actually turn off traction and stability control. And then we have a button for our hazard lights, and then the 5-speed manual shifter. In the middle, we have a warning that says that we don't conform to all the same safety standards as the average car sold in America, which is obvious since this is sold as a motorcycle. And then we have a handbrake right here in the middle. The instrument cluster moves as you tilt the steering wheel. We have our speedometer over here on the left, tachometer on the right, and a very small multifunction display here inside the speedometer. This gives us our fuel level, our odometer, and a small clock. There's a small button right here on top of the steering column that allows us to tick through the options on that screen, like range, our trip odometer, and exterior temperature. Since this interior is designed to be weather resistant, we have a urethane steering wheel with sport grips up top and a horn button right in the middle. In case you're wondering, the Slingshot does offer cruise control, and it's right over here on the turn signal stalk. I'm starting out this video out on our usual gravel road section because once we get out on the paved road, it's going to be a little bit too loud for you to be able to hear me. Again, Polaris does recommend that you wear a full face helmet, but I don't have one available, unfortunately, so I do have a DOT-approved not full face helmet and safety goggles, obviously trying to be as safe as possible without the full face helmet. There's definitely a reason that Polaris is telling you that you should wear one, of course, because we don't have that windscreen there. So any rocks or bugs or whatever that's kicked up by the vehicle in front of you, that could definitely come right here into your face. So obviously, safety first here at Alex and Autos. The overall ride of the Slingshot is actually not as firm as I had expected. Out on this gravel road, you actually cannot feel most of the smaller imperfections, although this is definitely still firm, don't get me wrong. This definitely has a much firmer suspension than something like a Mazda MX-5 Miata. And with that out of the way, let's get out on the paved road. Although the Slingshot exists somewhere between a car and a motorcycle, it feels like neither of them out on the road. It really feels more like a 173 horsepower skateboard with a seat and steering wheel bolted on. That's epic in either a good way or a bad way depending on your preferences. Let's start with the good. 0 to 60 happens in 5.2 seconds, which is in the realm of the Honda Civic Type R. Like the Honda Civic, you can get 0 to 60 faster if you're willing to roast the clutch, and of course get the model with the widest rear tire, which will give you the best acceleration. I suspect that 4.8 or 4.9 seconds is possible under the right conditions. For reference, the Saturn Sky with the same engine and transmission took 7.2 seconds to do the same thing, and that's where the ultra-lightweight construction of the Slingshot really comes into play. Braking happens in 108 feet thanks to the modern braking system used in the Slingshot, and it was completely uneventful. The stopping distance is short when viewed against performance cars, but could be considered a little bit long if you were to consider this against a motorcycle. Handling is excellent once you get over the pucker factor of the lively rear end and the vehicle's tendency to hop over broken pavement. Corners tend to take multiple steering corrections due to the quick steering and the lack of resistance from the rear end, so at first it may feel like you're fighting the vehicle around corners, but after a while you become attuned to the way the chassis behaves, and this is less of an issue. The bottom line is that this is an absolute blast out on the road. The feeling is raw, it's visceral, it makes you feel connected to the machine in a way that no other sports car on the road can. It brings back memories of my brother and I racing our Radio Flyer wagon down steep roads out in the foothills east of San Jose, only this time I have a helmet and a seatbelt. Now let's talk about the reasons you might want a Miata instead. Polaris jams the entire exhaust system just in front of the passenger's footwell, and the exhaust exits right around the same location. There are a few problems with this. First, you can feel the heat, especially if it's an already warm day and you're driving the Slingshot hard. Second, if you live down a gravel road as I do, it billows the dust into the cabin. Third, there's the sound. The engine is extremely loud, and the exhaust noise isn't really my cup of tea either. I suspect a longer exhaust system would have allowed better sound tuning, but that's not what's going on in the Slingshot because of the compact dimensions of the overall vehicle and where they chose to put all those exhaust components. Speaking of the sound, there's a lot of it going on. You can hear the belt in the back, the transmission gears, the tires, the angle gear in the rear driveline, and the rough engine exhaust note from behind the glove box, so be sure and wear ear protection. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're my height or taller, and I'm about 6 feet tall, don't get the Grand Touring model, which is the model with the sling shade top. Get the model without the roof, otherwise you'll have trouble seeing the road, traffic ahead, traffic lights, etc. I spent most of my time bent forward so I could actually see where I was going, and that would be a pain long term. Lastly, of course, there is the obvious lack of modern safety systems, aside from a well-tuned stability control system, which does do a good job of keeping the rear wheel in check. But beyond that, we don't have airbags, crumple zones, or windshields, of course. That very lack of those modern safety systems and the very raw and visceral feel that we get from the vehicle as a result is part of the allure of the Slingshot. And if it had those safety doodads, it would feel more like a Mazda Miata than a skateboard with seats bolted onto it, which is sort of the whole point of the Slingshot in the first place. Be sure and take a moment to let me know how you feel about all of that down there in the comment section below. So how much will a Slingshot set you back? Well, it starts at $19,999, which is significantly less than something like an MX-5 Miata. Although obviously this is more basic than a Miata. You won't get doors, you won't get a windshield, and of course we don't find all the features on that model that we're looking at right here. This is the top end trim. It starts at $29,499 and it has the shade on top. It also is tuned to be a little bit quieter than the SLR trim, which is the sporty version and that's going to be $28.99. And that's going to give you the widest tires, especially in the back where we get a 305 width tire. It's a really, really wide tire out back. The SL trim sits somewhere in the middle and it's $25,499. So this is definitely in the same range as something like the MX-5 Miata and significantly less expensive than an Alfa Romeo 4C. If you live in one of the states that classifies this as an autocycle, then it really has a very similar ownership experience to something like a weekend Mazda MX-5 Miata, because you don't need a motorcycle license to drive this. It's going to register as a motorcycle. It insures as something in this nebulous in-between, and you don't need that motorcycle license to drive one. Of course, it's not really a car either. It is something in this in-between world. This nebulous position of the Slingshot is one of its biggest assets and, of course, one of the biggest problems if you're looking at this versus a regular car, because a lot of people are going to be turned off by the fact that this doesn't have airbags, it doesn't have all the latest active safety technologies that you do find in a more modern roadster. But this is going to give you the ultimate open-air experience. So if you're simply looking for the most fun that three wheels can offer you for weekend fun, this is definitely going to be an interesting choice. If my money were on the line, especially if I was looking at this top-end Grand Touring trim, I would probably buy the MX-5 Miata instead. It's not going to be quite as much fun. The experience isn't going to be as raw, as visceral as we find in the Slingshot, but I think that overall it is just a hair more practical. I also like the fact that the MX-5 Miata is sort of the weekend car that you can drive every day and leave the practical car in your stable for weekend duty. So the MX-5 is the kind of car that you can commute with every day, and then the weekends when you need to carry your kids and your family around, that's when you pull the crossover out of the garage. The same can't really be said of the Slingshot, of course. This is going to be a little bit harder to drive every day, especially if you live in an area where it rains. Again, let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. What do you think about the 2019 Slingshot, and would you buy one over some of the other roadster options available in America? Let me know, and I will see you next week.